My name is Liz Johnston, and I'm here with my colleague, Emily Coombs Waddell, and we are both labor and employment attorneys at Verrill.
We are here today to follow up on our recent ACC presentation, Don't Get Caught, Traps for the Unwary and Employer DE&I Initiatives. And in this session, we are going to dig a little bit deeper into one of the most talked about areas for traps, which is the hiring process.
Yes, hiring and hiring strategies are so important, not only to a business's success, but growth as well, particularly in diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. But it is so important to be diligent, especially given the number of federal and state laws that exist protecting the hiring process and that apply and that are passed each year.
So before we get into the legal concerns at play within the hiring process, we are first going to spend a few quick seconds talking about a concept called implicit bias. So implicit bias is the stereotyping of particular qualities to a group of people. And it's important to note that this isn't something that some people have and others don't. Everyone does this to a certain extent, consciously or unconsciously. It's also important to note that implicit biases can be positive or negative. And this means that an individual could attribute a positive or negative characteristic to a group of people. While this is a social sciences concept, it is really relevant from a legal perspective, because if the implicit biases a manager or an employee holds relate to a protected trait or category, that could create liability for your organization, depending on the decisions they make that are informed by those biases. And then within implicit bias, there are many different ways that someone's bias may manifest. Often how we see this happen in practice is through something called a confirmation bias. And this typically occurs when we tend to listen only to information that confirms what we already believe. So in a hiring context, we could think of a situation where a hiring manager has a bias that interns from their alma mater say work harder than interns from another school. And that's only one example of implicit biases in action. And there are other ways that this can impact an organization from a hiring perspective as well.
Yeah, another example of an implicit bias, and sometimes these are referred to as well as cognitive biases, but it's called bandwagon bias. And this type of bias is really sort of a groupthink bias, and it happens when people tend to become biased or their opinions shift if they believe that there's a group that has a different opinion, or they sort of jump on the bandwagon, so to speak. So in the hiring context, we can see this where, as an example, we have a group of panelists who are interviewing potential employees. And maybe one interviewer has some concerns about a particular candidate, or maybe they're related to, a possible discrimination issue, or they have concerns about other people's biases. But when we go into the interview room and people discussing candidates and trying to make a decision and evaluate the candidates, that one individual might actually lose sight a little bit of their personal opinion and follow the direction of the rest of the group, and they'd be subject to bandwagon bias in that circumstance.
Yeah, that's a good example, Liz. And another one that kind of comes to mind is outcome bias. So that's where an individual looks at a situation and uses that to justify decisions that they made earlier. So an example I can think of here in a hiring situation might be where a hiring manager chooses a candidate and perhaps they go about it out of process. Maybe they take a referral that isn't aligned to the organization's process, or they don't interview other candidates that were qualified on the requisition because they found this candidate and they think, no one can even come close to their qualifications. If that employee or candidate turned employee ends up being a great fit in the organization, a good worker, the hiring manager might, use an outcome bias in their head to kind of justify the decision that they made, even though perhaps it wasn't aligned to the organization's rules or standards. So kind of thinking about all of these different ways that implicit bias can show up in the hiring process, it's really an important concept to be aware of, and especially taking into account the impact it could have on your organization and your organization's hiring goals.
Absolutely. I agree. It's so important. And, the question that I'm sure many of you who are listening are asking and that our clients ask us is, what do we do about this? How do we combat the effect of implicit bias and cognitive biases, especially in hiring? And so we really encourage organizations to look at their specific processes, the specific methods that they're using for hiring, to really find sort of the individualized risks and areas of potential improvement. But more generally, we do find that methods that provide multiple avenues for opinions and real objectivity can be really effective to combating biases in the hiring process. So having an interview panel and having multiple people responsible for that process might really mitigate the effect of a single individual's bias on hiring decisions. And especially when those environments are really accommodating to people speaking freely, using objective criteria, that can really help avoid the groupthink biases like the bandwagon bias that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, Liz. And I think the other thing I would also add is that starting up a standard process for reviewing candidates coming out of the interview process is really important. And that should also, tie back to objective criteria that should be, present on the job description, and just kind of making sure that you're looking at a candidate's resume, the qualifications that are necessary for the position, and using that all to make your decision. While interviews are an informative part of the hiring process, at the end of the day, organizations need to make sure that candidates are receiving the job because they're the best qualified candidate.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And another recommendation that we would have for our clients and for any organization looking to address bias is educating your management team and your hiring team, making sure that the people who are in these decision-making roles are aware of what implicit bias is and how to mitigate it and the effect that it could potentially have on decisions such as in hiring. And with that, accountability really is key. If you have these methods in place and these systems, these processes to keep your recruiting process objective and make sure the best candidates are being hired, accountability is really key to making sure that it's effective. Holding people accountable for following the processes that are in place, and also implementing corrective efforts and counseling if those processes are not being followed.
Absolutely. No, I totally agree, Liz. Well, I think that actually covers the amount of time we have today for our recommendation, but thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.